Ramen currency, how instant noodles became prison money. Subscribe for more real crime stories. Like, share, and join the discussion below. The sound of shouting echoed through the cold concrete hallway of the Rikers Island Correctional Facility. Guards rushed toward the commotion. Two inmates were locked in a violent struggle in the corner of the cafeteria. Tables overturned, trays crashed, and the unmistakable crinkle of plastic packaging littered the floor. What started the chaos wasn't drugs, or money, or territory. It was a single pack of ramen noodles, a packet worth less than $1 on the outside but priceless behind bars. When officers finally separated the men, one was bleeding from a cut on his face, the other shouting, "He stole my soups." It wasn't just about food. Inside these walls, ramen meant survival, a symbol of power and control. But that day's fight would spark something larger. A string of violent exchanges that forced prison officials across the country to admit a strange truth. Ramen had replaced cigarettes as the new prison currency. And buried beneath that revelation was a bigger question. How did instant noodles, a simple comfort food, become worth more than cash behind bars? To answer that, we have to go back. Before the fights, before ramen ruled the prison economy. It started in the mid-2000s, when U.S. prisons began cutting budgets and changing policies. Smoking bans removed cigarettes, the old form of trade, from commissaries. Food quality dropped. Meals became smaller, cheaper, less filling. Hunger crept in and resentment grew. Inmates needed something to barter with, something everyone wanted, and that's when ramen entered the picture. In prisons like San Quentin and Rikers, instant noodles were sold in commissaries for about 50 cents a pack. But to an inmate, that pack was a hot meal, a source of salt and calories, and a way to control hunger in a place where everything was rationed. Researchers later documented that ramen became more valuable than tobacco, or even stamps. One inmate could trade a single pack for snacks, soap, or laundry favors. 2 packs could buy protection or extra time in the phone line. Ramen was fast, portable, and didn't spoil easily. Perfect for trade. But with that new currency came greed and tension. Guards began noticing ramen debts written on scraps of paper. Inmates who couldn't pay back what they owed faced punishment from their own peers, fights, stolen property, or worse. What looked like a harmless snack had become a new black market economy inside prison walls. As one prison researcher put it, ramen became gold. And in the middle of that growing storm, one case, one deadly altercation over ramen, would expose just how deep this underground economy had gone. It began with a missing pack and ended with a man never making it out of his cell. It started with what seemed like a minor dispute inside the Pima County Jail in Arizona, a missing pack of ramen noodles from an inmate's bunk. But by the next morning, one prisoner, 33-year-old Robert Cotton, was found unresponsive in his cell. His death shocked both inmates and staff, not because of who he was, but because of why it happened. Investigators later learned that a debt of just 2 packs of ramen had spiraled into deadly consequences. Robert Cotton had been serving a short sentence for a nonviolent offense, a probation violation. He wasn't a troublemaker. In fact, he often used ramen to help other inmates who couldn't afford commissary. But that generosity came with strings attached. Ramen loans needed to be repaid, and in prison, owing someone could be dangerous. When Cotton's cellmate failed to pay him back, tensions began to build. Witnesses said the two argued over the debt late into the night. Guards heard nothing unusual until one of them found Cotton unresponsive the next morning. The autopsy ruled his death a homicide. The cause? Blunt force trauma after a violent altercation in his cell. The investigation quickly uncovered a growing network of ramen-based exchanges inside the facility. Prisoners weren't just trading for food. Ramen was being used for gambling bets, protection deals, and even payment for chores. What used to be cigarettes or stamps had now turned into what researchers later called a soups for safety economy. A 2016 study by Michael Gibson-Light, a University of Arizona sociologist, helped explain what investigators were seeing. He found that ramen had quietly become the backbone of prison trade across the United States. His research showed that in dozens of facilities, inmates used ramen as a replacement for cash because of declining food quality and rising tensions. The study even quoted one inmate saying, "It's easy. Soup's our money. You can't eat stamps." News outlets picked up the story, and soon the ramen economy became a national headline. Behind those walls, noodles weren't just food. They represented power, control, and survival. Some inmates even began cooking businesses, selling custom meals called spreads made with crushed ramen, chips, and sauce. But where there was profit, there was conflict. Officers described ramen-related fights breaking out weekly. Deaths were never forgotten. Some prisoners built alliances, ramen crews, that controlled supply and pricing. Others were targeted, bullied, or assaulted for refusing to trade. The more prison officials tried to regulate it, the more valuable ramen became. And as the ramen black market spread from one state to another, investigators started uncovering something even darker: organized groups smuggling ramen packs and using them as leverage in extortion and gambling rings inside the facilities. One warden summed it up grimly: "It's not about food anymore. It's about control." And control in the wrong hands was about to ignite one of the most violent riots in modern prison history, a riot that all started over ramen. The riot began just after lunchtime inside California's Donovan State Prison. It started like any other tense afternoon: guards moving between tiers, inmates returning from the yard, until a loud crash echoed through the block. A tray of ramen noodles had been thrown, followed by shouting and then chaos. Within seconds, dozens of inmates joined the fight, fueled by weeks of rising tension over ramen debts, unfair trades, and lost respect. The surveillance cameras later showed the first blow came from an inmate named Curtis "Slim" Harper, a man who, inside those walls, was known as the Ramen King. He controlled the noodle trade in his unit, setting prices and punishing anyone who undercut his deals. But that afternoon, one man, a quiet inmate named Darnell Thompson, refused to pay Harper's inflated rate for 2 packs. What should have been a small argument exploded into a full-scale riot that injured over 20 inmates and left parts of the prison in lockdown for weeks. When investigators pieced the event together, the story shocked the public. The fight wasn't about gangs, drugs, or weapons, it was about food. About the simple packs of instant ramen that had become so valuable they could buy loyalty, protection, or violence. Prison officials reported that ramen-related disputes had increased by nearly 60% nationwide. What had once been comfort food had evolved into a symbol of survival, and in some places, greed. Reporters and sociologists began to ask a deeper question: what drove this transformation? The answer pointed to America's prison system itself. With declining budgets, reduced meal quality, and overcrowding, inmates were hungry, not just for food, but for control over their lives. Ramen filled that void. It was reliable, flexible, and powerful. It gave inmates a sense of choice in a world designed to take choices away. Michael Gibson-Light's research resurfaced, confirming that ramen wasn't just prison currency. It was a response to deprivation. "It's about scarcity," he explained. "When food loses quality, anything that feels substantial becomes valuable." Ramen became gold because it was comfort in a packet. By the time the smoke cleared from the Donovan riot, officers had confiscated over 1,200 ramen packets during searches. Several inmates faced extended sentences, including Harper, who was transferred to solitary confinement. But what the warden said afterward lingered most: "We can stop the fights, but we can't stop hunger." Years later, documentaries and journalists revisited the ramen economy story, calling it the edible currency of survival. Even today, ramen continues to flow through prison trade systems nationwide. Some prisons now track commissary noodles like contraband, while others attempt to limit bulk purchases. Yet inside those concrete walls, ramen remains more than a meal. It's a symbol of a broken system, a story of hunger, power, and survival behind bars. And while the outside world eats ramen for comfort, inside America's prisons, it still decides who eats and who goes hungry.